All right, we are back, continuing this pre-recorded, though live. People who are listening out there, you can call with questions or email. The chat room is open at this moment. We're taping it. However, when you download it, obviously it won't be open at that point. We're talking with Douglas Dietrich, the actual topic of the show, which is the American secret space program. I have to actually keep reminding myself it's the United States of America, the corporation, let's call it, the secret space program, as opposed to the Americans, which takes actually two continents, if you think about it, south and north.
Yes.
So we're talking about that. We spent the first good hour uninterrupted talking about some questions that came up World War II. Now, we probably could do 50 shows, 10 hours each, and not hit everything, because the stuff that Douglas talks about is so intricate and detailed to reconstruct all the propaganda, lies, and omissions and ineptness in reporting and recording, whether it's intentionally lied and continues on from that point with the false patriotism. And so a lot of times it gets pretty long-winded. So when you tune into this show and you listen to Douglas Dietrich and myself, you better be prepared for a long one. And so that is that. And I want to bring back Douglas Dietrich, and you are back live recording.
Right.
And the reason why I bring up the Battle of Los Angeles is because we had a talk a while back about that, and you showed, and I put together actually the first YouTube video. And if people have not seen that, I recommend it. It's 2 parts, and it's 2 parts talking about the zombie stuff in that, and I singled out a segment dealing with some questions that was going on with things that were talked about in a thread with John Lear and others, and so that's by itself. And if you want to watch that alone to get the aspects about it, but I recommend watching the whole 3-hour item, because there's more later on in the show that I couldn't put in that one segment touching on that. But in that Battle of Los Angeles, in the UFO community, it is believed it was UFOs that were flying around. And I actually got a hold of some original audio and video from the time that it came out, and the actual people on the ground covering it, as well as the people who witnessed it, reported seeing dirigibles floating along and so forth, very slowly. And the only argument that came back was that, if it was dirigibles, they would have blew up because the arms would have hit them, and so forth. Also, there were planes fighting up there that you can't see, of course, in the dark video or dark film footage, but there were planes fighting and planes crashing from it, and a lot of debris and so forth that was cleaned up after it. So that at the time, they were like, everybody was all amazed. What was it? It looks like a dirigible. What is that? The UFO community has now claimed that as a UFO event and used some, I guess I can use the word logic or logical arguments to prove that it was UFOs as opposed to a dirigible. And now Douglas has come out with the evidence for these dirigibles and their durable dirigibility, that they could have withstood pass-throughs by shots because they had actually components, little compartments of gas rather than one big balloon, which makes sense and is smart and so forth. And so if we can go touch on that area again, you did talk a little bit about the compartments and so forth and so on, but respond to some of the questions. We talked about this off the air, so respond to some of the rebuttals to your assertions of a dirigible, super dirigible, as opposed to a UFO craft.
Right. Well, the first thing that I have to emphasize is the fact that when people scroll down my Facebook page, facebook.com/Douglas Duane Dietrich, they'll find the photos of the actual quote-unquote UFO that was seen over England in the 1960s. And there's a set of UFOs seen over England in the 1960s. I believe it was Sheffield, England. I might be wrong on that, just speaking from memory. Well, I dealt with the documents where the orders were given to basically airbrush a cut and paste of those photos of those UFOs from Sheffield, England, and put them into the search beams, in the center of the search beams at the Battle of Los Angeles. So that photo that you see when you look up the 1960 UFO incident in England, you'll see those exact same disc shapes that have been literally physically, back in those days, we didn't have Photoshop, which is a program. People would mechanically and physically have to cut and paste photographs, airbrush them, and then rephotograph them and create a composite. That was what was done with the search beams at the Battle of Los Angeles. If you take a look at the original photographs from newspapers of that day and age, you don't see that shape. That shape was later added. So that's important to emphasize in between all of those search beams. And you have to ask yourself as to what the search beams are focusing on. They're focusing on parasite planes that were released by the dirigibles, which is why you don't see the huge dirigibles themselves, which the people at the Battle of Los Angeles, if you look up the accurate, genuine eyewitness accounts from that time, from that place, not as they were later on colored and warped and woofed by the ufologists and the disinformation agents and the government propagandists who are interviewing them. These people would say, this one woman said, I saw it hovering over my home and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And she describes it almost like a giant Chinese lantern. And that's exactly what these giant super dirigibles were. They were known as aero dreadnoughts. And in terms of the parasite planes that they dislodged, another comparison to the ufological arguments. What is the primary thing they keep telling you with the Roswell myth? They keep telling you, oh, remember, the first thing they said was it was a disc. First thing they said was it was a flying disc from what might have been another world. That's the first thing they said. Then after that, everything came down. Believe what they said first. Well, the first thing they said about the Battle of Los Angeles was the Japs attacked the United States. That's the first newspaper headlines that came out. And on those same headlines, that very next day, they gave the street addresses where Japanese planes were shot down, primarily at 185th Street, Vermont Avenue, a street corner where a Japanese plane was shot down. Hollywood, another Japanese plane was shot down. And, of course, you're talking about thousands of witnesses. And as a matter of fact, when KGO News Talk in San Francisco, which used to have, at the time that I remember that they were discussing this subject, they had 1 million listeners a night. And this was back in the days when everyone listened to live radio. There was no computers. Nobody downloaded it. We're talking about the 1980s, back when I was working with the Department of Defense. And they were asking about the Battle of Los Angeles and asking for listeners to call in and write in about it. And within 2 weeks, they got over 200 letters and dozens of telephone calls. And they brought in eyewitnesses such as air raid wardens, and particularly notable was Dan Tryon. D-A-N was his first name, and his last name Tryon. His family name was T-R-Y-O-N. And Dan Tryon at that time lived in Redding, California. But back in the day of the Battle of Los Angeles, he lived in L.A., and he actually saw a Japanese airplane taken to Mines Field, M-I-N-E-S Field, by Air Corps personnel. He brought home pieces of bloodied parachute harness, bits and pieces of the plane, and he went there the next day with all of his friends. He was a newspaper peddler, just a kid at the time, and they all bicycled there the next day, and everything was gone. Everything was gone. The Army had cleaned it totally up, and there was one Air Corps warden who was there, and they asked him, what happened to all the Japanese planes? And he said, those was aliens.
Right, so I mean, this, the UFO traditionally has the alien, the weather balloon cover-up of the alien craft. I mean, that sounds pretty clever. I mean, for the ineptness, unless the ineptness came later with the generation and inbreeding, so to speak, because that sounds pretty clever, to come up with, to be able to clean all that up, to get it all together, and then come out with a cover story of the cover story.
But the question is,
or is it accidental?
No, it's intentional, and but it was also organic because they were working with it as they went along, which is why you have the Air Force come up with no less than 4 different cover stories for Roswell. Keep in mind, they always say the U.S. government's come up with it. Okay, that's part of the lie. The U.S. government has never said anything about Roswell. The U.S. government doesn't speak to Roswell until finally the CIA was given some orders under General Panetta. Excuse me. God, what's his name? I'm sorry. Panetta's the DOD secretary. I'm forgetting his name now. Petraeus.
Petraeus, yeah.
Yeah, and under Petraeus, now the CIA came up with a CIA agent who said, well, I saw something, but yeah, he was alien. But yeah, and then after a while he disappeared because what he said was so ridiculous. But in those days, what we had was the Office of War Information, OWI, which was commanded by the late Elmer H. Davis, who was a radio newscaster appointed to the position by President Roosevelt in 1942. He was the man who originally came up with the aliens theme because the propaganda from the Office of War Information, the intent was to make people believe that the United States was unassailable. We could attack them, but they couldn't attack us. That was his propaganda, and he's like propaganda minister Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels. Dr. Paul Joseph Goebbels, head of the Reichspropaganda Ministry, or the Ministry of Propaganda Enlightenment was its correct name in German. He was the only general, it is noted, that never lost the war. Now, there are generals who never lost the front, such as Kesselring. Kesselring maintained the front in the Nordic, Alpine, Italian Alps, northern Italy, until the last. The Americans were never able to break that line. Goebbels maintained the entire war effort to the end by keeping the German people mobilized to the end. We're going to get into that with the secret space program. He essentially won the war for the Third Reich government in exile by making the Americans hold off, stand back, using propaganda techniques and tools. Elmer Davis was the same way with the Office of War Information. He had the American public believing to this day, long after he's dead and gone, that the Japanese never made it here. It was aliens. Absurd and ridiculous story. Yet he was so masterful in his propaganda that it worked. Now, keep in mind, like I said, the government never spoke to Roswell until this recent General Petraeus CIA exigency. And until that point in time, it was only the U.S. Air Force that spoke to it. Now, keep in mind, the United States Army, there was no Air Force throughout World War II. Air Force wasn't organized until after Roswell. And CIA didn't exist in World War II. CIA wasn't organized until after Roswell. Both things were a direct result of Roswell. The United States was bucking for an Air Force. The United States Army wanted an Air Force specifically so they could have a traveling golf club for all the spoiled louts who had commanded the United States Army Air Corps. Now, they had earned their stripes during World War II because they had the highest rate of deaths and fatalities. Far more dangerous to be an airman than it was to be a Marine in World War II. Now they said, well, we've earned it. We're going to create something that's just a golf and country club. We want an Air Force where we do nothing all day. Certainly not combat. So the end result was they had the Roswell incident to contend with. They had to cover it up because if the United States public found out we were still legally at war with Japan, that United States airspace had been violated, that the United States had lost the war, then no one was going to finance an Air Force. So the Air Force ultimately has been always the one to address the Roswell incident. But all of its top secret documents belong to the Army, not the Air Force. CIA was created to take over Tonopah Army Airfield, now part of what's known as CIA Designate Area 51. They're all interconnected by underground tunnels. They're the same gray area on the map, and they're co-dominium. They co-administer it with the Air Force. So this is the connection. Army, Air Force suddenly gives all the excuses for something that is classified by the Army, the parent organization. CIA now comes up with an agent who calls in and says, oh, I saw evidence that this was all alien and crap. Well, who's administering the CIA at this point when a CIA guy comes out to say this? An Army general. Okay, all of this is connected. And in terms of all of it, it's part of the big lie. CIA co-administers the remnants of the Roswell debris, etc., concerning the Japanese prisoner of war interrogation and torture program, and all the rest of that. The Americans have a lot to hide. As for the Aero Dreadnoughts themselves, yes, they were compartmentalized. One giant 300-foot diameter balloon or so, surrounded by other balloons that were of a similar length and diameter. and they were all covered within a giant silk shell, and air is a gas, but within that air shell, to make them more dynamic, there was a series of 9 balloons, 8 surrounding a center balloon that were all contained the dangerous hydrogen peroxide created gases, the hydrogen gas, very flammable. But at the same time, in balloons that large, a bullet flies through, doesn't set it off, doesn't blow it up, and it can be easily patched. The Japanese were walking around inside of the super silk air shell to patch up the gas shells. When something couldn't be patched, they would jettison it. And they were able to make it to the United States and back to Japan. That was the primary so-called protest from so-called aviation experts. I'm not going to name names anymore, but, well, basically we may as well. It was John Lear at the time who said, with the kind of engines they had at the time, with the kind of fuel it would take, they could only make it one way to the United States. Okay, he's thinking of this going on under power. Now, the Japanese were able to bomb the United States with thousands of balloon bombs because of what is known as the jet stream. Now, because Hirohito was a marine biologist, the Emperor of Japan, and he studied the Kuroshio, the Japan current, he knew about the Japanese maritime current and its atmospheric equivalent, the jet stream. This is a river of air, which the Japanese used to launch ICUBs, intercontinental unguided bombs. 120,000 of them made it to the United States. The United States was entirely unable to stop them. And the whole point about this is that this wind blows at 300 miles an hour. The Americans didn't know about it at all when they started trying to bomb Japan. Even with B-29s, they ran headfirst into the jet stream. They were forced to hit the floor, so to speak, bomb really low, which exposed them to Japanese anti-aircraft fire, and they lost over 5,000 pilots and bombardier crewmen over the islands of Japan, of which less than 80 survived, because any one of them parachuted. These are the ones who parachuted alive. It was over 5,000 of them onto the Japanese islands. They were all massacred by the Japanese on the ground for bombing their cities. The lucky ones were caught by the police or the military for interrogation. So less than 80 of those 5,000 survived. This is why it was so dangerous to be an airman. Well, this is all part of the jet stream. Well, that's what carried the dirigibles here, was the jet stream. They're not expending any great degree of fuel. They're riding the jet stream. Now, when they come over here, the jet stream only goes one way, it doesn't go back. So then the question was, well, how would they make it back? Well, there's this current known as the California current. That's why they were flying so slow. If you look at that footage that James Arthur Jancik was kind enough to provide in my answers to John Lear, where Douglas Dietrich responds to John Lear's accusations of him being a disinformation agent, they're saying they're going slowly south. They're going slowly south. The dirigibles are going slowly south. That's exactly what the wartime audio says. Well, they're riding the California current. Well, where does that carry them? Into Mexico? No. It carries them into the equinoctial current. This is the tropical current at the equator. And they ride that back to Japan. Now, Japan today is enormous. It has more land area than the United Kingdom, more land area than France, more than United Germany. At that time, Japan wasn't just enormous, it took up half the globe. Japan stretched down to the equator. Japan's islands covered New Guinea. So we're talking about all they had to do was ride one current to another, and they're back into Japanese airspace. That is what they did. They dump load all of their aircraft, the parasite craft along the way, which are essentially suicide pilots who are running interference for the gunfire. That's what's drawing all the searchlights. That's what's drawing all the gunfire, because the guns have to fire on the parasite aircraft or the gun crew members are going to be killed. So they have to concentrate on the aircraft. They can't reach the dirigibles because the dirigibles are too high. This is what leads us to the space program. Basically, what happened was the Germans started bombing with high-altitude airships during World War I. And they found that cruising at high altitudes over 10,000 feet made navigation more complicated and difficult because there were many moving cloud formations below. So navigators became more and more dependent on radio signals to stay on course. But the bearings were usually unreliable. at best. And any use of wireless involved signals that immediately alerted British defenders and helped them to zero in on approaching raiders. So when airships reached altitudes of 13,000 feet and more, they also experienced engine trouble because the lack of oxygen necessary to make the fuel burn efficiently shut engines down. And in many cases, extreme cold and icing also became a problem that plagued the mechanics. And so they had to keep their engines from freezing up. There was no way the power engineers could design engines that would function properly near ground level, where summer afternoon temperatures might be in the 80s at the start of flights, and then drop during the night at very high altitudes to as low as 10 or 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Well, the Japanese didn't deal with any of that because they're riding the currents. They're taking advantage of nature because their emperor was a trained scientist who studied the environment of the globe across which a battlefield was made when the Americans forced Japan into war.
It would be like floating down the Mississippi as opposed to paddling up it.
Yes, and mechanical breakdowns would affect every part of the ship. The fabric would become so brittle it would break. Celluloid windows would shatter. Control cables would refuse to budge. Instruments containing fluids or lubricants would freeze and render the components useless. Well, the Germans conquered all of these technical difficulties in World War I. So the idea that the Japanese couldn't work with us in World War II is beyond insane. And when John Lear said, well, they stopped all lighter-than-air research in the 1930s, well, that's crazy because of the 120,000 balloon bombs that made it to the United States. Are they heavier than air? Lead balloons? I think not. So that's the kind of nonsense that we're dealing with now. As a trained pilot, we see who the disinformation agent truly is. There is no way he could have flown as many missions as he claims and not know about what I speak of. So, I mean, we can dismiss everything he says. Now let's concentrate on the physiological effect on officers and men, because that brings us into aerospace. It's devastating. You know, during the German bombings of London with high-altitude Zeppelins, or the lighter-than-air craft that they were deploying in World War I, they had as many as 24 mysterious deaths, later attributed to a form of heart failure caused by a combination of cold and lack of oxygen. Several men died when their primitive oxygen mask failed. World War I era oxygen masks, they were in isolated positions such as machine gun posts atop the airship. Now think about what I'm saying. See, just like the World War I Zeppelins, where the Germans carried machine guns on top of the airship so that they could fire at incoming aircraft attacking the airship, the Japanese also had this. This is a form of, you're higher than Mount Everest, and you're sitting in a machine gun atop a giant aircraft wearing an oxygen tank. This is an early form of space travel. Japan's aeronauts were early astronauts, and the Japanese chose the lightest, shortest men. Japan was a vegetarian nation. Japan ate no meat before the 1945 era, when the Americans introduced them to beef. So the average Japanese soldier was 5 feet tall. This is why Americans died at 7 times the rate in Japanese prisoner of war camps as they died in Nazi prisoner of war camps, because the Japanese would give them Japanese food that to Americans raised on beef. Americans, by the way, were the largest people on earth in World War II. They were the only nation that had ranges all across their continent where they could feed large herds of cattle. They grew up eating beef, huge amounts of protein. They got big and husky and strong, and they died of heat stroke in Asia, where they would be sweating out enough water weight to dehydrate them within minutes. And when they're fed on a Japanese diet, which to them was leavings, bait, and mulch, they starved to death. So in terms of the difference, when the Japanese deployed these aeronauts, they chose men who were 4 feet tall, the shortest men in Japan, the most underfed and impoverished class that was still able to commit to violence. The Yakuza, the Japanese mafia. Now, the Americans mobilized their mafia. Lucky Luciano supplied the Americans with information for the invasion of Sicily and beyond. The Americans mobilized the mob to beat up unionists and seek out saboteurs in American ports. Throughout World War II. The Japanese mobilized their mafia, the Yakuza. These were men who were underfed, 4 feet tall, and most of them through their cultic initiation rites as they graduate at different levels, cut off their pinky fingers as part of that ritual symbolism. So all the controls were made for men who were 4 feet tall and had 4 fingers on their hands. The Americans couldn't fly these ships. That's why they tortured Japanese prisoners of war into flying them whenever one of these craft was captured. This was the whole point behind the Roswell incident. Now, these Japanese, because they're at such high altitudes, static electricity can destroy you. It was static electricity which set the Hindenburg on fire. They set down a mooring line, the static charge went up, set the incredibly flammable paint on fire, silver nylon paint. And the silver nylon paint was extremely flammable. It's what made the Hindenburg all bright and shiny. That's what they repainted the Japanese aero dreadnoughts with that were surrendered unto the United States in 1945. The Americans repainted them in those colors so they could identify them in the moonlight, and they couldn't escape. That was what set the entire aero dreadnought on fire when the Japanese basically vented all the hydrogen gas and set a flare on to blow up the airship over Roswell. And all the prisoners came flying out of the sky in flames, etc. That is all part of that whole Roswell mystique. Now, the whole point that I'm making with that static electricity is that you, like, rub your feet on a mat and you touch a doorknob, you get 30,000 volts going through you. It doesn't kill you because it goes through it so fast. On airship, it can be deadly. So all these Japanese shaved their eyebrows, shaved their pubic hair, shaved everything on their body except for their eyelashes. Combined with the burns, they looked truly alien to American people. But they were contending as aeronauts with the kind of medical issues that had to do with altitude sickness.
I would imagine that a spark with hydrogen around you wouldn't be a wise thing either.
Well, yeah, it's not the... Keep in mind that the people who were on the Hindenburg, which was the largest civilian airline ever created, Skyliner, all of them who listened to the Capitan survived. The Capitan said, "Don't jump, stay with me. Despite this being an inferno, it's going to float safely to the ground." And everyone who listened to him, there were more people who survived the Hindenburg than died. More people listened to him, and they all survived. Everyone who listened to him lived. All the jumpers died. Everyone who died on the Hindenburg was a jumper. And whoever listened to him didn't burn because they stayed with him. And so that is the reality behind the Hindenburg. In the Japanese case, they were looking to kill themselves. They hit a flare because the Americans couldn't physically enter the ships. Even in World War I, the German aero dreadnoughts would carry vials of poison for a quick death, so when their ships were shot down, they wouldn't burn up with the hydrogen. Because they were at such high altitudes, unlike the Hindenburg, which was basically hitting the floor at ground level, so to speak. It was mooring. They were at high altitudes, they would burn to death. So rather than do that, they carried vials of poison. So the Japanese were able to secrete many ways to basically escape their captivity that the Americans couldn't discover even after strip searching them, because they couldn't enter their craft to dismantle where they hid flares or other secrets. I mean, one of the worst aspects of this is when I think of Paula Harris, and she talks about the Japanese aircraft, that dirigible that crashed over in the Texas region near the Alamogordo atomic bomb range on 1945. And when she brings that up, they say, "We found this alien metal. And look, it's got this fossilized fish bones, tiny little fish bones inside of this piece of metal." And I'm like, looking at that, I said, yeah, the Japanese ate anchovies. I mean, you're looking at the remains of Japanese food. And it's just crazy. It's crazy. You know, these people see something from, you know, with stencilized Japanese writing and calligraphy, and it's alien hieroglyphics. It's military stenciling. And most modern young people don't even know what stenciling is. Back in the old days, we'd take something that's shaped like a letter, spray paint it, and through that plastic shape, the letter would be formed in precision, uniform shape, and onto the surface on which you spray paint it, in which that plastic sheet cover with that hollowed out shape was providing the shape for the paint. That was Japanese military stenciling of Japanese calligraphy. which suddenly looks very alien. They used someone was kind enough to send me this on Facebook. They used that same lettering for the series V, which really ought to tell you something, since that was the most expensive science fiction series that was ever produced in the 1980s. It was the most expensive television series that had ever been produced, period, when it was produced in the 1980s. So, okay, so that's enough, I think, of the Japanese aerospatial war. We can go now into the secret space war as conducted by the Germans and the Americans and the Soviets at this point. But I hope that gives us a good introduction. You get an idea of what I'm saying about the kind of realities that we're dealing with and the kind of denials that we're dealing with.
All right. Well, tell you what. Let's just, at this point, we got that cleared off. Let's take a little break here, and then we'll come back and go right into the secret space program and all the items that you found. Okay, so let's hold on for a second, and we'll be right back.